Well, Barry, here we are to continue our discussion of fiscal rules as one of the responses to our being on the fiscal cliff, the federal fiscal cliff. Well, a few states are on a fiscal cliff as well, but let's stay focused on the federal situation for now. Next week, we'll discuss how we can learn from the states, how to handle the federal situation. But let's allay some fears in terms of these fiscal rules that they might put us in a straitjacket.
Well, I think that what we've argued in our book, The Fiscal Cliff, is that the U.S. is now incurring debt at an unsustainable rate, and that that's why we now have a debt crisis. That's why we now face a fiscal cliff. So I think one of the questions that we should address is, well, what is a sustainable level of debt? What level of debt does a country get into trouble with?
You know that it's probably a little higher for the U.S. because we have the dollar is the international currency, but the consensus seems to be around 60% of GDP. Now, we need to tell our listeners that there's two versions of the debt, so as not to be confused. There's the gross debt, which is probably around $35 trillion now and way above our GDP, and then there's the debt owed to the public, which is somewhere closer to our GDP. But in either event, something in the neighborhood 60% it seems sustainable. We're already way above that, and under current law, we're going to get even further above that. So I mean, we can make all these projections, but it's not sustainable what we're projecting to do. It's just a scary horror story of where we're how fast we're going to fly over the edge of the cliff if we keep on the current course.
Yeah, and I think we're already seeing some of the problems of debt at the levels that we're now incurring, higher interest rates and less willingness to hold U.S. debt in international markets. And as you say, a fiscal cliff can happen in a very quick and discontinuous way, where interest rates increase very sharply and suddenly countries find it difficult to issue debt in international financial markets. And so we've seen this kind of default in a number of other countries, and I think we're now at a level of debt where we're exposed to that kind of risk. Well, let me ask you another question, and that is, it seems that the source of the problem, of course, is spending, and especially emergency spending. Historically, we used to define emergencies very narrowly as a military war, and you might incur deficits and debt in a war, but then you would offset that with surplus revenue in peacetime. But that doesn't seem to be how we're defining emergencies these days. And what do we do about emergency spending?
Well, we need to provide for it, because that's one of the arguments that's made against fiscal rules, is that it puts us in a straitjacket and we wouldn't be able to ramp up spending quickly to respond to an attack or something a little more frightening as a pandemic than COVID turned out to be. And certainly the fiscal rules that we've proposed and others have proposed provide for exceptions to the fiscal rule in those times of declared emergencies and provide for repayment. But you know, on top of that, we need to note that without a fiscal rule, we're going to be really, really vulnerable to emergencies, because we are spending ourselves into a situation where we have no fiscal space to borrow additional money at an acceptable cost to ramp up defense spending or some other kind of emergency spending. And your question about emergency spending also gets into the word game of declaring lots and lots of things to be emergencies to get around existing weak fiscal rules. And we have a chapter in our book on that. Let me hold up the book for our viewers. We have a chapter in this book on emergency spending, redefined to cover lots of spending that didn't used to be seen as an emergency. That's a side issue. But first of all, we need to create fiscal space to be able to address emergencies, and we need a fiscal rule to do that. And then that fiscal rule needs to provide for an exception to the enforcement of the fiscal rule in times of emergencies.
Yeah, it seems like we define everything as an emergency these days. We had a financial crisis in 2008. We had this coronavirus pandemic, but whatever the label, the fact is for decades now, we've just been incurring deficits and accumulating debt without any sort of reserves or way to offset those deficits. Now, other countries there is a precedent for addressing this problem by creating a rainy day fund or emergency fund. And we've seen this at both the state level in the US and also in countries like Switzerland, where they have a debt break that also creates an emergency fund that is used to pay off deficits and debt incurred in so-called emergencies. How do these things work? What do you see a rainy day fund doing in this country at the federal level?
Well, it's a way to save for these inevitable hard times and to keep ourselves from getting even deeper into debt during those times is to prepare in advance. And also then we can have a very high threshold in terms of declaring an emergency to keep people from dipping into these savings accounts, these emergency preparedness funds, budget stabilization funds, rainy day funds, a lot of different names. But we need to have savings in advance, the ability to spend more than the savings, depending on the nature of the emergency, a way to pay it back later on, so that the emergencies don't ramp up our debt permanently.
Yeah, and I think we've seen the way that this works in countries like Switzerland. Switzerland, as we know, has the debt break, which requires that if there is an emergency, the country must repay that deficit within a finite time period, 6 years. And that's in the Constitution. That's something that is mandated. That's something that's a choice. And I found it interesting just this last couple of weeks. Actually, this year, we've seen how the debt break works in Switzerland in very powerful ways. Earlier in the year, the Swiss came up with a budget that exceeded their spending limit, and they went back to the drawing boards and recrafted a budget that was consistent with their fiscal rules. And then more recently, just in the last couple of weeks, there was a proposal to set up a fund, allocate some funds earmarked for the Ukraine war, and that would have required suspending their debt limit. There's the debt break, and the legislature refused to do that because they said it was a violation of their constitution. And I think what we're observing is how important it is that fiscal rules are incorporated in a constitution, as they are in Switzerland and as they are in the States, because it's much more difficult for legislators to just sort of finesse their way through, ignore the fiscal rules, or suspend them, which is what we routinely do at the federal level. So it seems to me that there's a precedent out there for dealing with emergencies, for dealing with them a way that's consistent with effective fiscal rules.
Indeed, the Swiss and later on the Germans, and to a lesser extent the Swedes, have all managed to, for example, get through COVID in a lot better shape than a lot of other countries. And not only did they get through COVID in better shape because of their fiscal rules, they're now going to pay back what little additional debt that they did incur as a result of COVID. Whereas here, without the fiscal rule, the new spending level always seems to provide a floor on future spending levels, even if it was based on emergency spending. And well, it's not sustainable, and that's why we're having these discussions about the fiscal cliff, because first of all, we need to understand what the tools are, but we also need to prepare some budget cuts, because they're not going to happen until there's symptoms of the going over the cliff. It's very difficult to get politicians to promise budget cuts, but we need to have them ready because in a budget crisis situation, a debt crisis situation, there will be cuts because there's probably not enough way to increase taxes enough to cover these any shortfalls in ability to borrow at acceptable rates from our bond buyers. I think we better cut it
I
off
know
there.
that I know you've thought a lot about the kind of budget cuts that might be required. Do you want to talk a little bit about the what budget cuts you would think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an easy way within the limits of our short video to do that. We need to return to fiscal federalism, and that's a good thing other than the bumpy transition to get there. We need to rediscover the 10th Amendment to our Constitution and get rid of things like the Department of Education and Housing and Urban Development, not because of what they're doing. That's another show at another time in another place. It's because there's no provision for that in the federal Constitution, and the states can do those things, and the states will need to think about doing some of those things in the near future when the unsustainability of what we're doing now at the federal level forces some cuts, hopefully cuts that will restore fiscal federalism. Well, we'll chat again next week and continue our series on the federal fiscal cliff and what it means and what we can do about it.
Okay, we'll talk about budget cuts some more, I'm sure.
Absolutely.